stop people-pleasing. You're an adult now, enough living for others. Right now, someone is saying yes when they mean no. Someone is staying late to finish a project that wasn't theirs to begin with. Someone is swallowing their anger, biting back their disappointment, forcing a smile because that's what good people do. And somewhere in that same moment, that same person is wondering why they feel so exhausted, so invisible, so utterly lost in a life they've spent decades building for everyone else. You know this feeling, don't you? Maybe you felt it in the quiet hours before dawn when the house is finally still, and you're lying there asking yourself who you've become. Maybe it hit you at your desk when your manager asked if you could take on just one more thing, and your mouth said yes before your brain even had time to object. Or maybe it was at a family dinner when someone made a careless remark about your life, and instead of defending yourself, you laughed it off because confrontation feels harder than swallowing the hurt. This isn't about being kind. Kindness is choosing to help someone because you genuinely want to. What we're talking about is something different entirely. A compulsion so deeply wired into your nervous system that saying no feels physically painful, like you're committing some unforgivable betrayal. People-pleasing isn't generosity. It's a survival strategy you learned when love felt conditional, when approval had to be earned, when being good was the only way to feel safe. And now, decades later, it's killing you. I don't mean that metaphorically. People-pleasers suffer from higher rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout than the general population. They experience chronic tension, migraines, insomnia, and digestive issues because their bodies are constantly bracing for rejection. They stay in jobs that drain them, relationships that diminish them, and obligations that suffocate them because, somewhere along the way, they absorb the message that their worth is tied to their usefulness. If you stop being helpful, the thinking goes, people will stop caring about you. And that fear, that primal, gut-level terror of being discarded, keeps you locked in a cage you built with your own hands. But what if the very beliefs that keep you trapped are lies? What if the things you've been told about goodness, selfishness, and human value are myths designed to keep you compliant, quiet, and endlessly available to everyone except yourself? That's what this audiobook is about. We're not here to give you surface-level advice about setting boundaries or learning to say no. Those are important skills, but they won't hold unless you dismantle the deeper programming, the myths that have been shaping your choices since childhood. In the chapters ahead, we're going to expose 5 critical myths that keep people-pleasers trapped. These aren't just misunderstandings. They're foundational lies that distort how you see yourself, your relationships, and your right to exist as a person with needs and desires. And once you see them clearly, once you understand how these myths have been operating beneath the surface of your life, everything changes. The first myth tells you that good people put others first. It sounds noble, doesn't it? Selfless, virtuous. But peel back the surface and you'll find something darker, an expectation that you should shrink yourself to make room for everyone else, that your needs are always secondary, that caring for yourself is indulgent or selfish. We'll show you why that's a lie and how it's kept you from living as a whole person. The second myth convinces you that wanting things for yourself is selfish. It frames every desire, every boundary, every act of self-care as evidence of moral failure. We'll reveal how this myth operates and why reclaiming your right to want is the first step toward freedom. The third myth ties your value directly to your usefulness. It whispers that if you stop being productive, helpful, or accommodating, you lose your right to be loved. This is the most insidious myth of all, because it makes you believe that your existence is conditional. We'll dismantle it piece by piece. And then there are the myths we'll uncover as we go deeper. The ones about guilt, obligation, and the fear of disappointing others. These myths don't just shape your behavior. They shape your identity. They convince you that people-pleasing is who you are, when in truth, it's just a strategy you adopted to survive a world that punished authenticity and rewarded compliance. This audiobook isn't about becoming a different person. It's about shedding the layers of conditioning that have been suffocating the person you've always been. It's about learning to distinguish between genuine kindness and compulsive self-abandonment. It's about understanding that you're allowed to take up space, to have preferences, to disappoint people, to choose yourself without apology. You're an adult now. That means something. It means you have agency, autonomy, and the right to decide how you spend your finite time on this planet. You don't owe anyone your silence, your exhaustion, or your life. And if that sounds radical, if it feels uncomfortable or selfish or wrong, then you're exactly where you need to be. Because the discomfort you're feeling isn't proof that this is wrong. It's proof that you've been conditioned to believe that your life belongs to everyone but you. Enough living for others. It's time to start living for yourself. Chapter 1. The myth. Good people put others first. Everyone's been lying to you about what good actually means. They told you goodness meant sacrifice, that it meant putting other people's needs ahead of your own, swallowing your complaints, showing up when you'd rather stay home, saying yes when every fiber of your being screamed no. They framed it as virtue, as nobility, as the highest form of love. And because you wanted to be good, because you needed to be good, you believed them. But nobody told you the cost. Marcus was 48 years old when he finally admitted he'd spent his entire life trying to be good. He hadn't built a life around happiness or fulfillment, or even a clear sense of who he was underneath all the obligations. He just tried to be good. It started young, the way it does for most people-pleasers. His mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. And he learned early that crying made things harder for her, that asking for things created stress, that the best way to love someone was to need as little as possible. So he became quiet, agreeable. The kind of child teachers called mature for his age, and family members praised as such a good boy. And Marcus carried that programming into adulthood like a stone in his chest. By his late 40s, he'd built what looked like a successful life, a steady job in middle management, a marriage that functioned, if not thrived. 2 teenage kids who spoke to him in monosyllables. He coached Little League on weekends because someone had to, hosted family dinners because his wife hated cooking, and volunteered for extra shifts at work because saying no felt like admitting he couldn't handle the pressure. From the outside, Marcus looked dependable, solid, good. On the inside, he was collapsing. It wasn't one thing that broke him. It was the accumulation, the thousands of tiny moments when he'd bitten his tongue, rearranged his schedule, absorbed someone else's frustration, or pretended he didn't mind when he absolutely did. His body had started keeping score. Tension headaches arrived every Sunday night before the work week began. Jaw pain from grinding his teeth in his sleep, exhaustion that never lifted no matter how much rest he got. Worse than the physical symptoms was the creeping realization that he couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him what he wanted. And if they had, he wouldn't have known how to answer. That's what the myth does. It convinces you that being good means erasing yourself. The myth operates on a simple premise. Your value as a person is directly proportional to how much you sacrifice. If you put yourself first, you're selfish. If you say no, you're difficult. If you have needs that inconvenience others, you're demanding. So you learn to minimize yourself. You become an expert at reading the room, anticipating what others need before they even ask, adjusting your behavior to keep the peace. You become so skilled at accommodating everyone else that you forget there's a person underneath all that performance who has preferences, boundaries, and limits. This isn't kindness. Kindness is a choice made from abundance. What we're talking about is compliance born from fear. The fear that if you stop being useful, people will stop caring about you. Think about the last time you said yes to something you didn't want to do. Maybe it was covering a shift for a coworker who'd already asked you twice this month. Maybe it was agreeing to host Thanksgiving dinner again because nobody else volunteered and you couldn't stand the awkward silence. Maybe it was something smaller. Letting someone cut in line because you didn't want to seem petty, or laughing at a joke you found offensive because challenging it felt too risky. In that moment, what were you really afraid of? If you're honest, it probably wasn't the task itself. It was the fallout, the disappointment, the potential conflict, the possibility that someone might call you selfish or difficult or ungrateful. So you swallowed your discomfort and said yes. And afterward, you felt that familiar mix of resentment and exhaustion. You'd done the right thing, but it didn't feel right. It felt like betrayal, not of the other person, but of yourself. That's because the myth has trained you to believe that your needs are less important than everyone else's comfort. It's convinced you that being a good person requires constant self-denial, that boundaries are selfish, and that love is measured by how much you're willing to endure. And the most insidious part? The myth disguises itself as morality. It tells you that resisting it makes you a bad person. Marcus didn't realize any of this until the morning he woke up at 3 a.m. with chest pain. His wife drove him to the emergency room convinced he was having a heart attack. The tests came back normal. Anxiety, the doctor said, handing him a prescription and a referral to a therapist. Marcus felt embarrassed. He wasn't anxious. He was fine. He'd always been fine. Except he wasn't. Sitting in that hospital bed, watching the fluorescent lights flicker overhead, Marcus had a thought he'd been avoiding for years. What if being good was killing him? What if the life he'd built, the steady job, the reliable reputation, the constant availability, wasn't a testament to his character, but a symptom of something broken? What if, after all these years of trying to earn love by being useful, he'd forgotten that he was allowed to exist without performing? The therapist asked him a question during their first session that Marcus couldn't answer. When was the last time you wanted something just for yourself? Marcus sat there for a long time. He could name what his wife wanted, what his kids needed, what his boss expected. But when it came to himself, the space was blank. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being a person with desires and become a function, a resource other people could draw from whenever they needed something. That's the cost of believing the myth. You don't just lose yourself. You forget you were ever there to begin with. If you recognize yourself in Marcus's story, you're not alone. Millions of people walk through life believing that goodness requires self-erasure, that love is something you earn through sacrifice, and that your needs are inherently less important than everyone else's. They've been taught this since childhood, by parents who punished emotions, by teachers who rewarded compliance, by a culture that celebrates martyrdom and mocks self-care. But what if the myth is wrong? What if being good doesn't require you to disappear? What if the most radical act of goodness you could commit is allowing yourself to exist as a whole person? Someone with needs, desires, limits, and the right to say no? That's the truth the myth has been hiding from you. You were never meant to be endlessly available, infinitely patient, or constantly accommodating. You were meant to be human, and humans need things. They have boundaries. They get tired. They have preferences, and none of that makes them selfish. The myth wants you to believe that putting yourself first is a moral failing. But the reality is this: you can't pour from an empty cup. You can't care for others if you're running on fumes. And more importantly, you shouldn't have to destroy yourself to prove you're worthy of love. Marcus is still learning this. It doesn't come naturally to him. After decades of conditioning, saying no feels like pulling teeth. Setting a boundary feels like betrayal. Asking for what he needs feels selfish. But he's trying. And slowly, painfully, he's realizing that the people who truly care about him don't need him to disappear. They need him to be present, not as a function, but as a person. The first myth tells you that good people put others first. It's time to see it for what it really is: a lie designed to keep you quiet, compliant, and endlessly available to everyone except yourself. Chapter 2. The myth: your needs are selfish. There's a word people pleasers learn to fear more than almost anything else: selfish. It's the label that gets slapped on anyone who dares to prioritize their own well-being, who sets a boundary, who says no without offering an elaborate justification. And because you've been taught that selfishness is the ultimate moral failing, you go to extraordinary lengths to avoid it. You say yes when you mean no. You give until you're empty. You accommodate, adjust, and apologize your way through life, terrified that if you ever put yourself first, you'll become the villain in someone else's story. But what if selfish doesn't mean what you think it means? What if the definition you've been carrying around, the one that equates self-care with narcissism and boundaries with cruelty, is fundamentally broken? What if the real selfish act is demanding that someone erase themselves to make your life easier? This is the second myth, and it's arguably the most damaging because it weaponizes your decency against you. It takes your natural desire to be a good person and twists it into a justification for self-abandonment. And as long as you believe that your needs are inherently selfish, you'll keep sacrificing yourself on the altar of other people's comfort. Marcus started recognizing this pattern after his panic attack landed him in therapy. His therapist asked him to keep track of every time he said yes to something he didn't want to do, and then note what he was afraid would happen if he said no. The list Marcus compiled over 2 weeks was illuminating and depressing. He agreed to work late 3 times because he was afraid his boss would think he wasn't committed. He hosted his in-laws for the weekend, even though he desperately needed rest, because saying no would have made him seem unwelcoming. He lent money to his brother for the 4th time this year, because refusing would make him look stingy. And when his wife suggested they skip their anniversary dinner because she was tired, Marcus immediately said it was fine, even though he'd been looking forward to it for weeks, because expressing disappointment would make him seem demanding. Every single yes was rooted in the same fear, that asserting his own needs would make him selfish. The therapist asked him a question he'd never considered. What's the difference between being selfish and having self-respect? Marcus didn't have an answer, so they broke it down. Selfishness, in its truest sense, means disregarding the well-being of others to serve yourself. It's taking more than your share, demanding special treatment, expecting people to sacrifice their needs so you can have what you want. Selfish people don't care if their actions hurt others as long as they get what they want. That's the key: the disregard for others' humanity. Having self-respect, on the other hand, means recognizing that your needs matter just as much as everyone else's. It means understanding that you're entitled to rest, boundaries, preferences, and time to yourself. It means accepting that caring for yourself isn't a betrayal of others. It's a prerequisite for showing up as a whole person in your relationships. But somewhere along the way, those definitions got tangled. You started believing that any attention you gave yourself was stolen from someone else. That rest was laziness. That boundaries were rejection. That wanting something for yourself meant you didn't care about other people. And that belief is destroying you. Think about the last time you said no to something. How long did it take you to justify that no? How many explanations did you offer? How much guilt did you carry afterward? People pleasers don't just say no. They build elaborate defenses around their refusals, as if saying no is a crime that requires a detailed alibi. I'd love to help, but I have a doctor's appointment. I wish I could, but my schedule is packed. Normally, I would say yes, but this week is just impossible. Notice the pattern? Every no comes wrapped in an excuse, an apology, a promise that this is an exception and not the rule. Because deep down, you believe that your needs alone aren't enough to justify saying no. You need a reason that sounds legitimate to someone else. You need permission to take care of yourself. That's what the myth does. It trains you to seek external validation for internal needs. Marcus's therapist gave him homework. The next time someone asked him to do something he didn't want to do, he was supposed to say no without explaining why. Just a simple, complete sentence. No, I can't do that. The first time Marcus tried it, his hands were shaking. His co-worker asked if he could cover her shift on Saturday. Marcus had plans, nothing urgent, just a quiet day to himself that he'd been looking forward to all week. In the past, he would have said yes immediately. This time, he forced himself to pause. No, I can't do that. His co-worker blinked. Oh, okay, no problem. And that was it. No interrogation, no guilt trip, no dramatic fallout. She just found someone else. Marcus spent the rest of the day bracing for consequences that never came. And slowly, something shifted. Maybe saying no didn't make him a bad person. Maybe protecting his time didn't mean he was abandoning his responsibilities. Maybe his needs weren't inherently less important than everyone else's. This realization doesn't come easily for people pleasers. You've spent years absorbing the message that caring for yourself is indulgent, that rest is something you have to earn, that boundaries are a luxury reserved for people who don't care as much as you do. And when you've been conditioned to see your own needs as selfish, every act of self-care feels like a moral transgression. But ask yourself this: if someone you loved came to you exhausted, overwhelmed, and desperate for a break, would you call them selfish for needing rest? Would you tell them their needs don't matter? Of course not. You'd tell them to take care of themselves. You'd encourage them to set boundaries. You'd remind them that they can't pour from an empty cup. So why don't you extend that same compassion to yourself? The myth wants you to believe that there's a hierarchy of needs, and yours are always at the bottom. That everyone else's comfort, convenience, and desires should come before your own. That if you're not constantly giving, you're failing as a human being. But the truth is this: your needs are not selfish. They're human, and denying them doesn't make you virtuous, it makes you unavailable. Think about what happens when you ignore your needs for too long. You become resentful, exhausted, disconnected from the people you're trying so hard to please. You stop showing up as your full self and start operating on autopilot, going through the motions of care while feeling nothing inside. That's not love. That's self-destruction. And yet the myth persists. It shows up in small ways: the guilt you feel when you take a sick day, the apology you offer when you ask someone to respect your time, the discomfort you experience when you do something just for yourself. It whispers that real love requires sacrifice, that true goodness means endless availability, that wanting things for yourself is evidence of moral weakness. But what if the opposite is true? What if the most generous thing you can do is show up as a whole person instead of a hollow shell? What if the people who love you would rather have a version of you that's rested, fulfilled, and present instead of a version that's perpetually drained and resentful? Marcus is still learning to distinguish between selfishness and self-respect. It's a slow process. Decades of conditioning don't disappear overnight, but he's starting to see the difference. Selfishness is demanding that someone give up their needs to serve yours. Self-respect is honoring your needs without requiring others to sacrifice theirs. You can care deeply about people and still set boundaries. You can love generously and still need rest. You can be a good person and still say no. None of these things make you selfish. They make you human. The second myth tells you that your needs are selfish. It's time to see that lie for what it is. A tool designed to keep you silent, exhausted, and endlessly available to everyone except yourself. Chapter 3. The myth. If you're not useful, you have no value. Marcus's father died when he was 53 years old. Not from cancer or a heart attack or any of the dramatic causes you see in movies. He died from exhaustion. The official cause was listed as cardiac arrest, but Marcus knew the truth. His father had worked himself to death. For 30 years, his father had been the dependable one, the guy everyone called when something needed fixing, the man who never said no, who showed up early and stayed late, who took on extra shifts because someone had to. When Marcus's mother asked him why he couldn't just rest, his father would shrug and say, "People need me." At the funeral, Marcus counted over 200 people. Colleagues, neighbors, extended family members his father had helped move, whose cars he'd repaired, whose problems he'd solved. They stood there crying, telling stories about what a good man he'd been, how generous, how selfless. And Marcus felt a rage he couldn't name building in his chest. Where were all these people when his father needed help? When his health started failing and he was too proud to ask for support? When he was drowning under the weight of everyone else's expectations? They'd taken everything he had to give. And when there was nothing left, they showed up to his funeral and called him a good man. That's when Marcus understood the third myth. The one that had killed his father and was slowly killing him too. If you're not useful, you have no value. This myth is more insidious than the others because it doesn't feel like a lie. It feels like truth. From the time you're young, you're taught that your worth is tied to your productivity, your ability to contribute, your willingness to be of service. Good children help around the house. Good students work hard. Good employees go above and beyond. Good people make themselves useful. And if you stop being useful, the myth whispers that you'll be discarded. This belief shows up in 1,000 small ways. It's the anxiety you feel when you take a sick day, as if rest is something you have to earn through suffering. It's the compulsion to answer work emails on vacation because being unreachable feels like abandonment. It's the guilt that floods you when someone offers to help, and you can't think of a task to assign them because asking for support without giving something in return feels like theft. People pleasers don't just help others. They need to help others. Because deep down, they believe that's the only reason anyone tolerates their existence. Marcus saw this pattern clearly after his father died. He realized he'd been living the same way, constantly proving his value through action, terrified that if he ever stopped being useful, people would realize he wasn't worth keeping around. His identity wasn't built on who he was as a person. It was built on what he could do for others. His therapist asked him a question that stopped him cold. If you couldn't do anything for anyone, if you were sick or injured or just needed rest, do you believe the people in your life would still want you around? Marcus wanted to say yes. He desperately wanted to believe that his wife loved him for more than his paycheck and his willingness to handle the things she didn't want to deal with. That his kids valued him for more than rides to practice and help with homework. That his friends saw him as more than a reliable favor dispenser. But he couldn't answer with certainty, and that terrified him. This is what the myth does. It trains you to see yourself as a transaction. Your worth isn't inherent. It has to be earned, proven, and continually reestablished through acts of service. And because that worth is conditional, you can never stop performing. You can never rest. Because rest means becoming useless, and useless means worthless. Think about the relationships in your life. How many of them are built on mutual respect and genuine connection? And how many are held together by the fact that you're useful? How many people would still be in your life if you stopped solving their problems, covering their shifts, lending them money, or absorbing their emotional chaos? The question isn't meant to be cruel. It's meant to wake you up. Because here's the truth the myth has been hiding from you. You were valuable before you ever did anything for anyone. Your worth doesn't come from your productivity, your helpfulness, or your willingness to sacrifice. It comes from the fact that you exist. You are inherently valuable as a human being, not because of what you do, but because of what you are. But the myth has convinced you otherwise. It's taught you that love is something you earn through service, that relationships are maintained through utility, and that the moment you stop being useful, you'll be replaced by someone who can do more. And the most devastating part? The myth uses your own fear against you. Because as long as you believe your value is conditional, you'll never stop trying to prove it. You'll work yourself to exhaustion. You'll say yes to things that drain you. You'll give until there's nothing left, because stopping feels like admitting you don't deserve to be loved. Marcus started testing this belief in small ways. He stopped offering to help before people asked. He let awkward silences sit instead of rushing to fill them with solutions. He took a weekend off and didn't check his email. And he watched to see who stayed. Some people didn't notice. His kids still came to him with their problems, not because he'd always solved them in the past, but because they trusted him. His wife still wanted to spend time with him, even when he wasn't fixing things or handling logistics. A few of his friendships, the ones that had always felt transactional, faded. And that hurt. But it also clarified things. The people who loved him didn't love him because he was useful. They loved him because he was him. And the ones who only valued his utility. Those relationships had never been real to begin with. This distinction is critical. There's a difference between being generous and being exploited. Generosity flows from abundance. You give because you want to, because you have something to offer, because the act of giving feels meaningful. Exploitation happens when people take because they've learned you'll always say yes, that your boundaries are negotiable, that your time and energy are free resources they can draw from without reciprocation. The myth wants you to accept exploitation as generosity. It wants you to believe that being endlessly available is a virtue, that never saying no is a sign of good character, that exhausting yourself in service to others is the highest form of love. But it's not love. It's self-destruction. And the saddest part is that the people benefiting from your self-destruction often have no idea how much it's costing you. They think you're just naturally helpful, that you don't mind, that it's easy for you. because you've gotten so good at hiding the strain. You smile through the exhaustion. You say, "It's no problem," when it absolutely is a problem. You pretend you're fine because admitting you're not would mean admitting you need something, and needing something feels like proof that you're failing. Marcus's father never admitted he needed help. Right up until the moment he collapsed, he maintained the fiction that he was fine, that he could handle it, that he didn't need anyone. And by the time people realized how badly he was struggling, it was too late. Marcus doesn't want to die the same way, so he's learning to separate his value from his usefulness. He's practicing saying things like, "I can't help with that," without offering an excuse or a replacement solution. He's letting people be disappointed without rushing to fix their feelings. He's resting without guilt. And slowly, painfully, he's beginning to believe that his worth isn't something he has to earn. You don't have to earn your worth either. You don't have to prove you deserve to exist. You don't have to be useful to be valuable. Your life has meaning because you're alive, not because of what you produce, solve, or fix for other people. The third myth tells you that if you're not useful, you have no value. It's time to recognize that lie for what it is. A trap that keeps you running on empty, convinced that rest is laziness and that your worth expires the moment you stop performing. Your value is not conditional. It never was. Chapter 4. The Awakening. When people-pleasing breaks. There's a moment in every people-pleaser's life when the system finally breaks. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. There's no dramatic revelation or lightning bolt clarity. It's quieter than that, more devastating. For Marcus, it happened on a Tuesday. He'd spent the morning handling a crisis at work that wasn't his responsibility. His coworker had made a mistake on a client presentation, and rather than let her face the consequences, Marcus had stayed up until 2 a.m. fixing it. Then he'd driven his daughter to school because his wife had an early meeting, even though his route to work was in the opposite direction. At lunch, his brother called asking to borrow money again, and Marcus said yes, even though they were barely making ends meet themselves. In the afternoon, his boss asked if he could work late to cover for someone who'd called in sick, and Marcus agreed despite having promised his son he'd be at his basketball game. By the time Marcus sat down in his car at 7 p.m., he felt hollow. Not angry, not sad, just empty. Like someone had reached inside his chest and scooped out everything that made him human, leaving behind a machine that said yes to every request and no to nothing. He sat there in the parking lot with his hands on the steering wheel, and a thought surfaced that he'd been pushing down for years. I don't know how much longer I can do this. That's the awakening. The moment when you realize that the strategy that got you here, the constant accommodating, the endless giving, the reflexive yes to every demand, isn't working anymore. It never was working, really. You were just too busy performing to notice. The breaking point doesn't always look like a breakdown. Sometimes it looks like a quiet recognition that something fundamental has to change. Sometimes it's the creeping awareness that if you keep living this way, there won't be anything left of you to save. Marcus drove home in silence. He walked past his family without speaking, went upstairs, and closed the bedroom door. When his wife knocked and asked if he was okay, he said, "I'm fine," because that's what he always said. But for the first time, saying it felt like lying. He wasn't fine. He'd been so far from fine for so long that he'd forgotten what fine actually felt like. This is where the shift begins. With honesty. With admitting, even if only to yourself, that you can't keep doing this. That something has to give. That you're not infinite. And the people in your life who've been treating you like a renewable resource need to understand that there are limits. the myths we've dismantled so far. The belief that good people put others first, that your needs are selfish, that your value depends on your usefulness. They all work together to keep you trapped in this cycle. They convince you that the exhaustion you feel is normal, that the resentment building in your chest is a character flaw, that if you were stronger or better or more disciplined, you'd be able to handle it all without breaking. But you were never supposed to handle it all. Nobody is. The awakening happens when you stop blaming yourself for being human, when you recognize that the system is rigged, and the only way to win is to stop playing by rules that were designed to exploit you. Marcus started noticing patterns he'd been blind to before. The way certain people only called when they needed something. The way his boss's "just this once" requests had become a weekly expectation. The way his wife had stopped asking if he minded doing things because she'd learned he'd say yes regardless. The way his kids took his presence for granted because he'd trained them to believe he was always available. None of these people were monsters. They weren't deliberately trying to drain him. They were just doing what people do, taking what's freely offered. And Marcus had been offering himself freely for so long that everyone in his life had come to expect it. That's the trap. You teach people how to treat you. And if you've spent years teaching them that your time, energy, and needs don't matter, you can't be surprised when they believe you. The awakening forces you to confront a difficult truth. The life you've built is built on self-betrayal. Every time you said yes when you meant no, every boundary you failed to set, every need you swallowed to keep the peace. Those weren't acts of love. They were acts of self-abandonment. And the people who benefited from them learned to rely on your silence. Marcus's therapist told him something that landed like a punch. You've spent your entire life being afraid that if you stop people-pleasing, people will leave. But you need to ask yourself, who's already left? Because the person who's been disappearing all these years is you. That hit Marcus harder than anything else. He'd been so focused on keeping everyone else happy, on maintaining the peace, on being the reliable one, that he hadn't noticed how little of himself remained. He'd become a function instead of a person, a role instead of a human being. The awakening isn't comfortable. It's messy and painful and often filled with regret. You start seeing all the moments you could have spoken up but didn't. All the times you prioritized someone else's minor convenience over your own significant need. All the relationships that were built on your willingness to disappear. But it's also the beginning of freedom. Because once you see the pattern clearly, once you understand that people-pleasing isn't protecting you, it's destroying you, you can start making different choices. You can start saying no. You can start setting boundaries. You can start asking yourself what you actually want instead of reflexively deferring to everyone else. It won't be easy. The myths you've been living by don't dissolve overnight. The people in your life who've benefited from your endless availability won't applaud when you start setting limits. Some of them will push back. Some will call you selfish. Some will leave. And that's okay. Because the people who love you, really love you, not just the utility you provide, will adjust. They'll respect your boundaries. They'll support your growth. And the ones who won't? Those are the people who were never in relationship with you. They were in relationship with what you could do for them. Marcus is still in the middle of this process. He's still learning to say no without guilt. He's still fighting the urge to fix everyone's problems. He's still battling the voice in his head that tells him he's being selfish when he chooses himself. But something fundamental has shifted. He knows now that the old way doesn't work, that being good doesn't require being gone, that he has the right to exist as a whole person with needs, limits, and desires. The awakening doesn't give you all the answers. It doesn't magically make the guilt disappear or the boundaries easy to set. What it does is show you the truth. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You've spent years believing that people-pleasing kept you safe, that it earned you love, that it made you good. But the reality is that it's been eating you alive. It's stolen your time, your energy, your health, and your sense of self. And the only way out is through the discomfort of setting boundaries, through the fear of disappointing people, through the grief of realizing how much of yourself you've lost. The awakening is when you finally admit that enough is enough, that you can't keep living this way, that something has to change, and that something is you. Not because you're broken or weak or failing, but because you're finally ready to reclaim your life. Marcus sat in that car for 20 minutes before he went inside. And when he finally walked through the door, he didn't apologize for being late. He didn't offer explanations or make promises to do better. He just sat down with his family and said, "We need to talk." That conversation didn't solve everything, but it started something. And sometimes starting is the hardest part. The awakening is when you realize that people-pleasing isn't kindness. It's a cage, and you're the only one who can open the door. Chapter 5. Your nervous system learned to say yes, even when it should say no. Marcus thought understanding the problem would make it easier to change. He'd read the books, talked to his therapist, recognized the patterns. He knew people-pleasing was hurting him. He knew he needed to set boundaries. He knew his needs mattered. So why did saying no still feel like pulling his own teeth out? Why did his stomach drop every time he considered declining a request? Why did guilt flood his system when he prioritized himself? Why, even when he logically knew he had every right to refuse, did his body respond as if saying no was an act of violence against someone he loved? The answer isn't in your conscious mind. It's buried deeper than that, written into the wiring of your nervous system. Because people-pleasing isn't just a bad habit you picked up along the way. It's a survival strategy your body learned when you were too young to have any other options. Marcus's therapist introduced him to something called polyvagal theory. The science is complex, but the core idea is simple. Your nervous system has different modes, and it switches between them based on whether it perceives safety or threat. When you feel safe, you're in what's called the ventral vagal state. Calm, connected, able to think clearly. When you detect danger, your nervous system shifts into fight or flight mode. And if the threat is too overwhelming to fight or flee from, it collapses into shutdown. For most people-pleasers, the threat that shaped their nervous system wasn't physical violence. It was something subtler and more pervasive. Conditional love. Marcus grew up in a household where affection was unpredictable. His mother wasn't cruel, just stressed. She worked long hours, juggled bills she couldn't pay, and had little bandwidth left for emotional warmth. When Marcus was quiet and helpful, she'd smile at him. When he made demands, cried, asked for attention, expressed needs, she'd snap. "I can't deal with this right now, Marcus. Just be good." So he learned. The lesson sank deeper than thought. It settled into his body, into the part of him that registered safety and danger before words could form. His nervous system absorbed the message that compliance kept him safe, that expressing needs triggered rejection, that love had to be earned through silence and service. This isn't a memory you can recall. It's encoded in your body. And decades later, long after you've grown up and left home, your nervous system still operates from that childhood programming. When someone asks Marcus for something now, when his boss requests overtime, when his brother needs money, when his wife suggests he handle something she doesn't want to deal with. His conscious mind might recognize that he has the right to refuse. But his nervous system is screaming a different message. Saying no is dangerous. Saying no means rejection. Saying no means you're not safe. That's why change is so hard. You're fighting biology, not just habits. The therapist asked Marcus to notice what happened in his body when he considered saying no. So the next time his coworker asked him to cover a shift, Marcus paused. He paid attention to the sensations rising in his chest, the tightness, the shallow breathing, the way his heart rate spiked as if he just stepped in front of a speeding car. His body was reacting to the possibility of saying no as if it were a life-threatening event. This is what people don't understand about people-pleasing. It's your nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do. Keep you alive by keeping you compliant. Because when you were small and powerless, compliance was survival. Keeping the adults around you calm and happy meant you were safe. Making waves meant chaos. So you learned to read the room, anticipate needs, adjust your behavior to minimize conflict. And your nervous system remembers that lesson. Even now, even when you're an adult with agency and options, your body still operates as if your survival depends on keeping everyone else comfortable. This is why guilt is so powerful for people pleasers. It's a danger signal. When you feel guilty for prioritizing yourself, what you're actually feeling is your nervous system warning you that you violated the rules that kept you safe as a child. And because your body can't distinguish between childhood powerlessness and adult autonomy, it floods you with the same panic you felt when you were 4 years old. And your parents' approval felt like life or death. Marcus started working with this knowledge instead of against it. He couldn't just logic his way past his nervous system's panic. He had to teach his body a new pattern. And that meant moving slowly. The therapist taught him a technique called grounding, a way to calm his nervous system before attempting to set a boundary. When someone asked him for something, instead of immediately responding, Marcus would pause. He'd count 3 slow breaths. He'd mentally repeat a phrase his therapist had given him. I'm safe. This feeling will pass. Saying no is not a threat. It felt ridiculous at first, but over time, it worked. Because the thing about the nervous system is that it responds to patterns. If every time you set a boundary, disaster follows. If people yell, withdraw, or punish you, your nervous system learns that boundaries equal danger. But if you set a boundary and nothing catastrophic happens, your nervous system starts to recalibrate. Slowly, painfully, it begins to understand that saying no won't kill you. This process isn't linear. Marcus still has days when the guilt is overwhelming, when the physiological response to saying no feels unbearable. But he's learning to distinguish between real danger and nervous system memory. He's learning that just because something feels dangerous doesn't mean it is. There's another layer to this that's important to understand. People pleasers often attract people who benefit from their compulsive compliance. These people aren't predators, necessarily. The system is just self-reinforcing. If you're someone who never says no, people around you stop asking if you're okay with things. They assume your yes is genuine because you've never given them reason to question it. And when you finally do say no, they're genuinely confused. Because from their perspective, nothing changed. They've been making the same requests they always have. What they don't realize is that your yes was never freely given. It was extracted by the same nervous system programming that made saying no feel impossible. Marcus's wife had no idea how much he'd been overriding his own needs until he sat her down and explained it. She genuinely thought he was happy to handle all the household logistics, to always be the one who compromised, to never push back on her decisions. Because that's what he'd shown her. And when he finally admitted how exhausted and resentful he'd become, she was shocked. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. And Marcus didn't have a good answer. Because the truth that his body had been programmed decades ago to believe that speaking up meant danger sounded absurd. How do you explain that even though intellectually you know you're allowed to have needs, your biology is screaming at you to stay quiet? This is the work. Retraining your nervous system, teaching your body that safety doesn't require self-erasure, that expressing needs won't lead to abandonment, that you can set boundaries and still be loved. It takes time. Marcus has been working on this for months, and he's still not where he wants to be. But he's learning to recognize when his nervous system is hijacking his decisions. He's learning to pause, breathe, and choose a response instead of reacting from old programming. He's learning that the discomfort he feels when setting boundaries isn't a sign that he's doing something wrong. It's a sign that he's doing something new. Your nervous system was shaped by your early experiences. If love felt conditional, if expressing needs brought punishment, if compliance was the price of safety, then your body learned to prioritize other people's comfort over your own well-being. And that programming doesn't disappear just because you logically understand it's outdated. But it can change. Your nervous system is capable of learning new patterns. It just needs evidence. Evidence that saying no doesn't end in disaster. Evidence that boundaries don't mean rejection. Evidence that you can prioritize yourself and still be safe. Marcus is building that evidence one small no at a time. And slowly, his body is starting to believe him. Chapter 6. The Myth. If you say no, people will leave you. The first time Marcus said no to his brother, he couldn't sleep that night. It wasn't a big no. His brother had called asking to borrow $300, the fourth time in 6 months. In the past, Marcus would have said yes immediately, maybe asked when he'd get it back, and then never brought it up again when the money didn't materialize. This time he said, "I can't do that." There was a pause on the line. Then his brother said, "Seriously? You're really going to leave me hanging?" Marcus's chest tightened. His brother sounded angry, disappointed. And beneath that, Marcus heard something worse. The threat of withdrawal, the unspoken message that if Marcus wasn't useful, if he stopped being the reliable one, maybe his brother wouldn't be around anymore. So Marcus almost caved. The words, "Never mind, I'll figure it out," were forming in his throat. But then he remembered what his therapist had told him. The fear of people leaving is often stronger than the actual risk of them leaving. And sometimes, the people who leave when you set boundaries were never really there for you in the first place. Marcus stayed quiet. His brother hung up. And for the next 48 hours, Marcus braced himself for the fallout. This is the fourth myth, and it's the one that keeps people-pleasers locked in place even after they've recognized all the others. Because you can understand, intellectually, that your needs matter, that selfishness is a distorted concept, that your value isn't tied to your usefulness. You can even accept that your nervous system needs retraining. But none of that matters if you believe that setting boundaries will cause the people you love to walk away. This fear isn't irrational. For many people-pleasers, it's rooted in real experience. Maybe when you were young, affection was withdrawn when you didn't comply. Maybe love felt conditional, present when you were good, absent when you made demands. Maybe you watched a parent give someone the silent treatment for days after a disagreement and learned that conflict didn't lead to resolution. It led to abandonment. So you absorbed a terrifying equation: boundaries, rejection. And decades later, Even though you're an adult with the capacity to survive rejection, your body still reacts to the possibility of someone leaving as if it's a death sentence. Marcus had spent his entire life avoiding this moment. Every yes he'd ever given, every boundary he'd failed to set, every time he'd swallowed his resentment and smiled, it was all motivated by the same primal fear that if he stopped being easy, accommodating, and endlessly available, people would decide he wasn't worth the trouble. And now that he'd finally said no, the waiting was unbearable. His brother didn't call back that night, or the next day. By the third day, Marcus was spiraling. He imagined his brother telling the rest of the family that Marcus had turned into a selfish jerk. He imagined being cut out of family gatherings. He imagined the quiet rejection that would follow. Not dramatic, just a slow fading where people stopped reaching out, stopped inviting him, stopped caring. His wife noticed. "You've been checking your phone every 5 minutes." "I'm fine," Marcus said automatically. "You're not fine. What happened?" So Marcus told her, and she looked at him for a long moment before saying, "Do you think your brother would actually cut you out of his life over $300? Marcus wanted to say no. He wanted to believe that his relationship with his brother was built on something deeper than money. But the truth was, he didn't know. Because he'd never tested it. He'd spent 48 years making sure no one had a reason to leave. That's what the myth does. It convinces you that the only thing holding your relationships together is your compliance. That people tolerate you because you're useful, because you don't cause problems, because you make their lives easier. And the moment you stop playing that role, they'll walk away. But what the myth doesn't tell you is that relationships built on compliance aren't real relationships. They're transactions. And the people who leave when you set boundaries, they were never in relationship with you. They were in relationship with what you could do for them. Marcus's therapist had asked him a question weeks earlier that he'd been avoiding. If someone only stays in your life because you never say no to them, is that a relationship worth keeping? At the time, Marcus didn't want to answer because the implications were too painful. If he accepted that premise, it meant acknowledging that some of the relationships he'd been desperately trying to preserve might not be worth preserving. That some of the people he loved might not actually love him back, at least not in a way that honored his full humanity. On the fourth day, Marcus's brother called. "Hey," he said. "Look, I was pissed, but I get it. You've been bailing me out for years, and I've been taking advantage. I'm sorry." Marcus almost cried. Because what he'd been bracing for, the rejection, the anger, the permanent withdrawal, didn't happen. His brother was still there. And more than that, he'd actually reflected on the pattern. He'd taken responsibility. The relationship didn't end. It shifted. And that shift, painful as it was, brought them closer to something real. This won't always be the outcome. Some people will leave. Some will get angry and never come back. Some will accuse you of changing, of becoming difficult, of no longer being the person they thought you were. And those losses will hurt. But here's the truth you need to hear. The people who leave when you set boundaries are making space for relationships that can hold your full self. Every time you sacrifice your needs to keep someone around, you're teaching them that your presence comes with conditions, that you're only acceptable if you're accommodating. And that's exhausting. It's lonely. It's a form of self-erasure that guarantees you'll never be truly known or truly loved, because the version of you that people are loving isn't real. When you start setting boundaries, you're essentially saying, "This is who I actually am. These are my limits. This is what I need." And yes, some people won't like it. Some will push back, some will leave. But the ones who stay are the ones who see you as more than a function. They're the people who want a relationship with the real you, complete with needs, limits, and preferences. And those are the relationships worth having. Marcus is still learning this. 6 months into his journey of setting boundaries, he's lost some people. A few friendships that were built entirely on his availability faded when he stopped always being free. A coworker who used to rely on him to cover shifts got irritated and stopped inviting him to team lunches. His brother's wife made a passive-aggressive comment at Thanksgiving about how Marcus had changed. And yeah, it hurt. Marcus grieved those losses, because even when a relationship was unbalanced, it was still a relationship. And losing it felt like proof that the myth was right, that he wasn't lovable unless he was useful. But alongside those losses, something else happened. His wife started trusting him more because she finally understood what he actually wanted instead of just guessing. His kids began coming to him with real problems because they saw him modeling what it looked like to have boundaries. And a couple of friendships deepened in ways Marcus hadn't expected, because for the first time, he was showing up as himself instead of as a role. The myth tells you that people will leave if you say no. And sometimes they will. But what the myth doesn't tell you is that the people who leave were keeping you small. They were benefiting from your self-abandonment. And their departure, as painful as it is, creates space for something better. You don't have to keep everyone in your life. You don't have to be loved by people who only love the version of you that never causes them inconvenience. You're allowed to prioritize relationships that honor your full humanity over relationships that require you to shrink. The fourth myth says that boundaries will drive people away. The truth is that boundaries reveal who was actually there to begin with. Chapter 7. The myth. Your guilt proves you're wrong. The guilt was the worst part. Marcus could handle the anxiety that came with setting boundaries. He could even tolerate the fear that people might leave. What nearly broke him every single time was the crushing wave of guilt that followed every no he gave, every boundary he set, every moment he chose himself over someone else's expectations. It felt like undeniable evidence that he was becoming exactly the person he'd spent his whole life trying not to be. Selfish, uncaring, wrong. 3 months into therapy, Marcus told his wife he needed 1 night a week to himself. He didn't have a specific plan for it. He just needed space, time to exist without being needed by anyone. She said, "Of course, that makes sense." And Marcus felt guilty for hours afterward. He couldn't explain it. She hadn't been upset. She'd agreed immediately. There was no conflict, no punishment, no withdrawal of affection. And yet, his body was flooded with the same shame he'd feel if he'd done something unforgivable. That's the fifth myth. And it's the one that keeps people-pleasers trapped even after they've started doing the work. Because you can dismantle the other myths intellectually. You can understand that your needs aren't selfish, that your value isn't conditional, that boundaries don't automatically mean abandonment. But then you feel the guilt. And the guilt feels like evidence that you're wrong. Here's what you need to understand. Guilt is not a moral compass. It's a conditioning response. For most people-pleasers, guilt was installed in childhood as a control mechanism. Maybe you had a parent who weaponized guilt to keep you compliant. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? Maybe you grew up in a family where expressing needs was framed as burdening others. Don't bother your mother, she's tired. Maybe love was offered with strings attached, and those strings were woven from guilt. So you learned that guilt meant you'd done something wrong. That feeling guilty was synonymous with being a bad person, and now, decades later, Your nervous system still produces that guilt response every time you violate the old programming, even when the violation is something as reasonable as taking time for yourself. Marcus's therapist explained it this way. Your guilt isn't telling you that you're doing something wrong. It's telling you that you're doing something different. That distinction changed everything for Marcus. Because once he understood that guilt was just a signal his nervous system had been trained to send whenever he deviated from compliance, he could stop treating it as evidence. He could feel guilty and still recognize that he had every right to the boundary he'd set. This doesn't make the guilt disappear. Marcus still feels it. Every time he says no, every time he prioritizes his needs, every time he disappoints someone, the guilt shows up like clockwork. But now he knows it's just his body's outdated alarm system going off because it hasn't fully adjusted to the new pattern yet. The myth wants you to believe that guilt is your conscience speaking, that it's a sign you've crossed a moral line. And sometimes, guilt is appropriate. If you've genuinely hurt someone or violated your own values, guilt serves as a corrective signal. But for people-pleasers, guilt has been so overused and misapplied that it no longer functions as a reliable indicator of right and wrong. You feel guilty for taking a sick day. You feel guilty for declining an invitation. You feel guilty for asking someone to respect your time. You feel guilty for existing in a way that requires anything from anyone. That's trauma, plain and simple. Marcus started keeping a guilt journal. Every time he felt guilty after setting a boundary, he'd write down what he'd done, and then ask himself 3 questions. Did I violate my own values? Did I intentionally harm someone? Would I feel guilty about this if someone else did it? Most of the time, the answers were no, no, and no. When his coworker asked him to cover a shift and he said no, Marcus felt guilty. But he hadn't violated his values. He'd honored his need for rest. He hadn't harmed anyone. His coworker found someone else. And if another coworker had said no, Marcus wouldn't have thought twice about it. The guilt wasn't rational. It was just noise. Learning to distinguish between appropriate guilt and conditioned guilt takes practice. Appropriate guilt shows up when you've acted in ways that conflict with your values. Conditioned guilt shows up when you've acted in ways that conflict with your programming. For Marcus, conditioned guilt showed up every time he stopped performing the role of the endlessly available nice guy. Even when what he was doing was healthy, reasonable, and necessary, the guilt screamed at him that he was failing. And the people in his life, the ones who'd benefited from his inability to say no, sometimes reinforced that guilt. His mother said, "You've changed," in a tone that made it clear she didn't mean it as a compliment. A friend made a joke about how Marcus had gotten too important to hang out. His brother's wife muttered something about how not everyone can afford to put themselves first. Those comments stung because they activated the exact shame Marcus had been carrying since childhood. They confirmed what the guilt was telling him, that prioritizing himself made him a bad person. But Marcus is learning to see those comments for what they are. Attempts to pull him back into the role that served everyone else. Because when you start changing, when you stop being endlessly accommodating, the people around you have to adjust. And some of them won't want to. They'll try to guilt you back into compliance because your growth is inconvenient for them. And when that happens, the guilt intensifies. Because now your internal programming and the people you care about are both telling you you're wrong. This is where the work gets hard. Because resisting external guilt requires you to trust yourself in ways you've never had to before. It requires you to hold your boundaries, even when people are actively trying to make you feel bad for having them. Marcus is still learning this. 6 months in, and there are days when the guilt is overwhelming. Days when he wonders if he's being selfish after all. days when it feels easier to just go back to the old pattern and make everyone else happy. But then he remembers what his life looked like before he started setting boundaries. The exhaustion, the resentment, the hollow feeling of being used. And he realizes that the guilt, as painful as it is still better than the slow death of self-abandonment. The fifth myth tells you that guilt is evidence you're doing something wrong. The truth is that guilt is often proof you're doing something new. It's your nervous system's way of signaling that you've stepped outside the boundaries it was trained to keep you within. And yes, that feels uncomfortable. Yes, it will take time for your body to recalibrate. Yes, some people will try to use that guilt to pull you back into old patterns. But discomfort isn't the same as danger. Guilt isn't the same as wrongdoing. And feeling bad about setting a boundary doesn't mean the boundary was wrong. It means you're still learning to trust that you have the right to set it. Marcus doesn't feel guilty anymore when he takes his one night a week. It took months, but eventually his nervous system stopped sending the alarm. Because every week he took that time and nothing catastrophic happened. His wife didn't leave. His kids didn't resent him. The world didn't fall apart. And slowly, the guilt faded, because his body finally learned what his mind had known all along. He was allowed to take care of himself. You're allowed to feel guilty and still do what's right for you. You're allowed to set boundaries that make other people uncomfortable. You're allowed to disappoint people. You're allowed to exist in ways that require things from the people around you. And the guilt you feel about all of that? It's just an echo of a lesson you learned when you were too young to know better. It doesn't mean you're wrong. Chapter 8. The First Boundary. How to say no without falling apart. Knowing you need to set boundaries and actually setting them are two completely different things. Marcus had spent months in therapy, understanding why people-pleasing was destroying him. He'd dismantled the myths. He'd learned about his nervous system. He'd journaled about guilt. He knew, intellectually, that he had every right to say no. And yet, when his boss asked him to work through the weekend again, Marcus's mouth opened, and the word that came out was, "Sure." He sat in his car afterward and wanted to scream. Because he'd done it again. He'd had the perfect opportunity to set a boundary, and he'd defaulted to the same automatic yes that had been running his life for 48 years. His therapist told him something that helped. You're not going to wake up one day and suddenly be good at saying no. It's a skill. And like any skill, it takes practice. So Marcus started small. Really small. Embarrassingly small. The first no he successfully gave was to a telemarketer. The guy called asking if Marcus wanted to upgrade his internet service. In the past, Marcus would have listened to the entire pitch, felt guilty about wasting the guy's time, and maybe even signed up for something he didn't need just to avoid the discomfort of refusing. This time, he said, "No thanks," and hung up. His hands were shaking. His heart was pounding. And he felt absurdly proud of himself. Because that's where you start. With the low-stakes no. The one where the relationship doesn't matter, where there's no history, where the person on the other end isn't someone whose approval you've spent your whole life trying to earn. Marcus practiced saying no to things that didn't matter. No to the grocery store cashier asking if he wanted to donate $1 to charity. No to the email asking him to take a survey. No to the neighbor's kid selling fundraiser candy bars. Each time, the physiological response was the same. Tightness in his chest, shallow breathing, the urge to backtrack and apologize. But each time, he pushed through it. And each time, nothing bad happened. The telemarketer didn't call him selfish. The cashier didn't judge him. The neighbor's kid just shrugged and moved on to the next house. Slowly, Marcus's nervous system started learning a new pattern. Saying no doesn't lead to catastrophe. Then he moved to slightly higher stakes. He declined an invitation to a co-worker's birthday happy hour. He told his mother he couldn't talk because he was in the middle of something. He said no when his friend asked him to help move furniture. And that's when things got complicated. His friend asked if Marcus could help move some furniture on Saturday. Just a couple hours. In the past, Marcus would have said yes automatically. This time, he paused. He took a breath. And he said, "I can't help with that." There was a beat of silence. "Wait, seriously?" his friend said. "Come on, man, it'll take like 2 hours." Marcus felt the guilt spike. The old Marcus would have caved immediately. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "I can't do it this time." "Why not? You got plans or something?" Marcus paused. He didn't owe an explanation, but the urge to justify was overwhelming. "Yeah, I do." His friend went quiet for a moment, then sighed. "All right, fine. I'll figure something out." The call ended. Marcus sat there feeling like he'd just betrayed someone. He waited for his friend to reach out. Days passed, then weeks. He texted once. "Hey, how did the move go?" No response. A month later, Marcus saw him at a mutual friend's party. His friend gave him a cold nod and spent the entire evening on the other side of the room. The friendship was over, and it hurt. Marcus grieved it. But his therapist asked him a question that landed hard. Was that friendship built on mutual respect, or was it built on your availability? Marcus didn't have a good answer, because the truth was, his friend had only been around when Marcus was useful. And when Marcus stopped being useful, the friend disappeared. That loss was painful, but it was also clarifying. The next boundary Marcus set was at work. His co-worker asked him to cover a shift on Saturday. She'd asked before, and he'd always said yes. This time he said, "I can't cover that shift." She blinked. "Really? I'm in a bind here. My kid's sick and I don't have anyone else to ask." Marcus felt his resolve wavering. A sick kid. That was legitimate. Maybe he should just... "I'm sorry," he said. "I can't. You covered for me last month. I just need this one favor." The guilt was crushing. But Marcus remembered what his therapist said. Other people's emergencies don't automatically become your responsibility. "I understand you're in a tough spot," Marcus said, "but I can't help this time." Her tone shifted. "Wow, okay. Guess I know where I stand." She walked away. Marcus felt like garbage for the rest of the day. The next week, Marcus noticed the shift. His co-worker wasn't outright hostile, but she was cold. She stopped including him in group lunch plans. She'd have conversations with other team members that would go quiet when he walked into the room. And then Marcus heard through another co-worker that she'd been talking. Marcus isn't a team player anymore. He's gotten selfish. It stung, because part of him wondered if she was right. Maybe he was being selfish. Maybe he should have just covered the shift. But another part of him, the part that was learning to trust his own boundaries, knew that covering one more shift wouldn't have fixed anything. She would have asked again, and again, because she'd learned that Marcus always said yes. The relationship at work never fully recovered. They were polite, professional. But the warmth was gone, and Marcus had to accept that. The third boundary was with his mother. She called one afternoon while he was in the middle of something. In the past, he would have dropped everything. This time he said, "Mom, I can't talk right now. I'm in the middle of something. This will only take a minute. I really need to go." Her voice changed. "You're never too busy for your mother, Marcus. I raised you better than that." There it was, the guilt weapon she'd perfected over decades. "I'll call you tonight," Marcus said. "Don't bother. I can tell when I'm not wanted." She hung up. Marcus stared at the phone, the familiar shame washing over him. But he called her that evening like he'd promised. She answered on the first ring. "I'm glad you called," she said. Her tone was still a little tight, but she was there. They talked for 20 minutes. It wasn't easy. His mother made a passive-aggressive comment about how he was too busy for family these days. Marcus almost apologized, almost backtracked. Instead, he said, "I care about you, Mom, but I also need time for myself." She went quiet. Then she sighed. "I know. It's just hard. You used to always have time." Marcus realized something. His mother wasn't trying to manipulate him. She was adjusting, slowly, painfully, but she was trying. Over the next few months, the dynamic shifted. His mother stopped calling at random times, expecting immediate availability. She started asking, "Is now a good time?" And when Marcus said no, she'd say, "Okay, call me when you can." It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Marcus learned that boundaries have different outcomes. Some people will leave, some will resent you, and some, the ones who genuinely care, will adjust. And that's the hardest lesson. You can't control how people respond to your boundaries. You can only control whether you set them. A year into this practice, there were still days when the old impulse to say yes almost overpowered him. Some relationships felt impossible to shift. There were moments when the guilt nearly broke him. But he had started building a life that belonged to him. He had time that felt like his own. He had energy left at the end of the day. He was no longer just a resource for everyone else. That first real boundary is always the hardest. Decades of conditioning, a nervous system wired for compliance, the fear that everything might collapse if you finally say no. All of it comes up. But having survived the discomfort once, you prove to yourself that you can do it again. It's never easy, but slowly, you stop asking permission to exist. And that changes everything. Chapter 9. The Price of Freedom. Learning to live with guilt as your old self fades. Guilt didn't disappear the moment Marcus started setting boundaries. Instead, it transformed. It became less like a sledgehammer crushing him and more like a persistent ache. The kind you notice most when everything else is quiet. The worst moments came at night. Marcus would lie awake replaying conversations he'd had days earlier. He'd think about his mother's disappointed silence after he said he couldn't call her. He'd imagine his coworker venting to others about how selfish he'd become. He'd scroll through his phone looking for messages he hoped wouldn't come, and dreading the ones that did. What surprised him most was how unpredictable the guilt could be. Sometimes it arrived immediately after a boundary, sharp and accusatory. Other times it came hours later, sneaking up when he was alone, whispering familiar lies. You've hurt people. You're becoming someone nobody wants around. You should go back to the way things were. On one particular evening, Marcus sat in his car after a work meeting where he'd declined to stay late for a social event. He felt the guilt creeping in, heavy, suffocating. His phone buzzed with a message from his wife. Home by 7? 7 simple characters, and yet his mind spiraled. Was she angry? Was she questioning his choices? Was she reconsidering whether she'd married the right person? He called her, his voice tight. "Hey, everything okay?" she asked, genuinely surprised. "Yeah, I skipped the team event tonight. I needed to come home." There was a pause. Then she said, "Good. You've been working too hard. I'm glad you did something for yourself." Marcus sat in the silence of his car, feeling foolish. The guilt had created a narrative in his head that had absolutely no grounding in reality. His wife wasn't disappointed. She was relieved. But here's what nobody tells you about guilt. Understanding that it's irrational doesn't make it disappear. Logic doesn't eliminate the feeling. Knowing your boundary is reasonable doesn't stop your nervous system from screaming that you're abandoning people. His therapist explained this one afternoon. Your guilt is like a smoke alarm in a house that used to be on fire. For decades, the fire was real. Your survival depended on keeping people happy. So the alarm evolved to be extremely sensitive. Now, even when there's no fire, even when you open a window on a cold day, the alarm goes off. Your body can't distinguish between real danger and old memory. So how do I make it stop? Marcus asked. You don't stop the alarm, she said. You learn to hear it, acknowledge it, and move forward anyway. You live in a way that proves to your nervous system, repeatedly, consistently, that boundaries don't lead to abandonment. This reframing changed something for Marcus. He stopped trying to eliminate guilt and started treating it like a symptom to be witnessed rather than obeyed. He began a small ritual. Whenever guilt arose, he would pause and write 3 things down. What boundary did I just set? What is my nervous system telling me? What is actually true? One afternoon, he set a boundary with his brother. They'd been planning a weekend fishing trip, and Marcus had committed before realizing he'd already promised his daughter he'd help with a school project. He called his brother and explained the situation. Come on, man, you already said yes, his brother said, frustration bleeding through the phone. You can do the school project another time. Marcus felt the guilt surge. His brother was disappointed. By pulling out, Marcus was letting him down. The old instinct was to cave, to apologize profusely, to find some way to do both things, even if it meant sacrificing sleep and sanity. But he'd made a promise to his daughter first, and more importantly, he'd made a promise to himself. I know I said yes before, Marcus said carefully, but I can't do this trip. I have another commitment and I need to honor it. His brother didn't respond well. Fine, forget it. I'll find someone else. The line went dead. Marcus sat with the guilt for a while. He wrote, I chose my daughter's time over my brother's expectations. My nervous system says I'm selfish, that he'll never forgive me, that family is ruined. The truth is, I'm being a more present father. My brother is disappointed, but he'll survive. Family is more resilient than my fear suggests. What Marcus noticed over the following weeks was that his brother eventually texted, Hey, found someone to go. No hard feelings, man. The catastrophe never came. The relationship survived the boundary. His brother wasn't thrilled, but he accepted it. And Marcus's daughter got her time with him. This became the pattern. Each time Marcus set a boundary and the guilt came, sometimes mild, sometimes overwhelming, he would survive it. Nothing catastrophic would happen. Relationships would shift, sometimes uncomfortably, but they didn't shatter. And slowly, the guilt became less urgent, less demanding. It didn't disappear entirely. There were still moments. Sitting alone in the morning before the day started, or lying in bed at night, when the old whispers returned. But they no longer had the same power, because now Marcus had evidence. He had lived through the guilt. He had set boundaries, and the world had kept turning. People had stayed or left, but his survival had never actually been threatened. What emerged alongside this realization was something unexpected. Relief. Relief so profound, it sometimes brought him to tears. For the first time in decades, Marcus could breathe without constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of every room he entered. He could have a thought or a preference without immediately analyzing whether it might disappoint someone. He could exist without justifying his existence. The guilt didn't vanish, but it lost its authority. It became background noise, present but no longer directing his life. One evening, his mother called. She'd been trying to reach him for 2 days. Marcus picked up the phone with mild apprehension. The old guilt flickered. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Marcus, I was thinking, would you want to have dinner with me this Sunday? No pressure, just if you have time." Marcus almost gasped. His mother was asking, not demanding. She was offering space, not claiming it. "Yeah, I'd like that," he said. And he meant it. Over dinner, his mother seemed different, lighter somehow. As if by finally respecting his boundaries, she'd given herself permission to relax. Their conversation flowed in ways it hadn't in years. They laughed. They disagreed about something political. And instead of Marcus immediately backing down, they actually discussed it. It wasn't a conflict to be avoided, but a genuine exchange between two people with different viewpoints. As Marcus drove home that night, he realized something. Guilt wasn't his enemy. His old nervous system wasn't broken or bad. It had done its job. It had kept him compliant when compliance seemed necessary for survival. The guilt was the alarm system that had protected him when he was powerless. But he wasn't powerless anymore. The guilt would probably linger for years, maybe forever. But it no longer owned him. He had learned to exist alongside it, to listen to it without following it, to feel it without letting it dictate his choices. And somewhere in that space, between the old alarm and the new freedom, Marcus finally felt like he was coming home to himself. Chapter 10. Rewiring your life. Building new habits. When everything inside you resists. After a year of setting boundaries, Marcus noticed something unexpected. The external shifts felt manageable compared to the internal disorientation. His schedule had opened up. People called less. Conversations felt different. But inside, he felt suspended between two worlds. The old Marcus, who always said yes, and the emerging Marcus, who was learning to say no. Neither felt entirely comfortable yet. This liminal space is where most people quit. The initial relief of boundaries wears off. The guilt remains present but less acute. And suddenly you're left with a raw realization. Freedom requires responsibility. You have to decide what to do with all that reclaimed time. You have to figure out who you actually are when you're not performing for others. Marcus sat in his therapist's office one afternoon, looking visibly frustrated. "I finally have time," he said. "But I don't know what to do with it. I feel like I'm wasting it, or I feel guilty for not using it productively. It's like I've been so busy saying no to other people that I haven't figured out what I'm actually saying yes to." His therapist smiled slightly. That's actually the real work starting. Setting boundaries was the demolition. Now comes the construction. The construction began slowly. Marcus started noticing which activities felt genuinely restorative versus which ones he'd convinced himself he should do. He'd spent 48 years optimizing his life around others' preferences. He'd never actually asked himself, what do I enjoy? What energizes me? Who do I want to become? The first thing Marcus did was pay attention to the subtle sensations in his body. When he said no to his boss about staying late, his shoulders dropped. When he scheduled time alone, he noticed his breathing deepened. When he pursued something purely because he wanted to, a morning run, reading a book uninterrupted, sitting outside without checking his phone, his nervous system actually seemed to settle. He started small. Every Sunday morning, he protected 2 hours. No obligations. No productivity targets. Just presence. He'd walk through his neighborhood, stop at a coffee shop, sit without agenda. Some days he'd journal. Other days he'd just exist. His family noticed these mornings were sacred to him, and they stopped asking him to break them. One morning, sitting on a park bench, Marcus realized something. He'd never developed a sense of what he actually liked, independent of other people's needs. His hobbies had been what he thought he should do or what fit around others' schedules. His friendships had been service-oriented. His career had been about proving his worth. Even his marriage had been, on some level, built around his ability to anticipate and meet his wife's needs. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. His wife noticed the shift. One evening, she asked him what he wanted to do for his birthday. Marcus froze. Nobody had ever really asked him this question. Sure, they'd asked, "What do you want?" But always in the context of logistics or small tokens. His wife was asking him to actually consider what would bring him joy. "I have no idea," he said honestly. Over the next week, Marcus really thought about it. Not what he thought he should want. Not what would make others happy. What would actually feel like a gift to himself. He decided he wanted a solo trip, a long weekend alone, to a place he'd never been. With no agenda, his wife surprised him with the booking. 3 days in a small town on the coast, a modest hotel, no expectations. Marcus felt guilt initially. Shouldn't he be spending his birthday with family? But he also felt something else. Anticipation. Genuine excitement. Those 3 days shifted something fundamental in Marcus. Without anyone needing him, without any performance required, he discovered parts of himself that had atrophied. He discovered he loved early mornings and long silences. He discovered he had opinions about things he'd never had space to consider. He discovered he liked his own company. When he returned home, his family asked about the trip. And instead of minimizing it or making jokes at his own expense, Marcus talked about what he'd experienced. He talked about his feelings, his discoveries, his needs. His children listened. His wife listened. And something subtle shifted in the family's understanding of who Marcus was beyond his role as caretaker. But the real rewiring wasn't about Marcus's individual growth. It was about how his boundaries changed the entire system. When Marcus stopped being available for every request, his colleagues at work had to figure out their own problems sometimes. This was uncomfortable for them initially, but it also meant they developed agency. They learned to be resourceful. The team didn't collapse without Marcus solving everything. When Marcus stopped rescuing his brother actually had to confront the patterns in his own life. He couldn't call Marcus every time something went wrong. He had to sit with his own consequences. It was painful to watch, and Marcus had to resist every urge to step in and fix it. But over time, his brother started making different choices. When Marcus stopped managing his mother's emotional temperature, his mother had space to grieve what had been lost and to gradually appreciate what remained. She stopped leaving guilt-laced voicemails. She started asking real questions instead of making demands. Their relationship became gentler, less fraught. These shifts didn't happen overnight, and some relationships did end permanently. Marcus did lose connections that had been built entirely on his availability. The sting of those losses never completely disappeared. But alongside the grief came clarity. Those relationships had been hollow. They'd been built on a fiction. What Marcus discovered was that his boundaries weren't selfish. They were actually the most generous thing he could do. By honoring his own limits, he was giving others permission to do the same. By modeling self-respect, he was showing his children what that looked like. By taking his own needs seriously, he was demonstrating that it was possible to be both caring and boundaried. Around month 8 of this rewiring process, Marcus realized he hadn't replayed a conversation obsessively in several weeks. The guilt no longer had the urgency it once did. When it arrived, he could observe it without being hijacked by it. He could think of his friend who'd ghosted him and feel sadness without shame. He could think of his mother and feel genuine warmth toward the work she was doing to adjust. One afternoon, Marcus was at work when a colleague approached him with a favor. Could he cover a shift? The old Marcus would have immediately sensed the weight of obligation, would have read criticism into the question, would have automatically said yes while quietly resenting it. The new Marcus paused. He considered his schedule. He considered his needs. And he said, "Not this time, but I appreciate you asking." There was no elaborate justification, no apology, just a simple, clear answer. His colleague said, "Okay, thanks anyway," and walked away. Marcus sat for a moment, aware of a subtle shift inside. The guilt didn't come, or if it did, it was barely perceptible, a whisper rather than a scream. This was what rewiring actually felt like. Not a dramatic transformation, but 1,000 small moments where the new response became slightly more automatic than the old one, where saying no felt a little more natural, where protecting himself didn't feel like betrayal, but like self-respect. Marcus was still a people-pleaser at his core. That hadn't vanished. He still cared deeply about others' well-being. He still made sacrifices for people he loved. The difference was that now these acts came from genuine choice rather than compulsion. Now they came from a place of abundance rather than desperation. By the end of the year, Marcus noticed he laughed more easily. His body held less tension. His wife said he seemed lighter, not absent, but more present. His kids didn't demand his attention in the same desperate way. They'd learned he would be there, but not in that exhausted, fractured way where he was giving energy he didn't have. The rewiring wasn't complete. It probably never would be. But Marcus had finally stepped off the hamster wheel. And from that vantage point, he could see it had been turning in the wrong direction all along. Conclusion: you are allowed to exist. 2 years into his journey, Marcus sat across from his therapist for what had become a routine appointment. The office hadn't changed, same soft light filtering through the blinds, same worn leather chair, same box of tissues on the side table. But everything about Marcus had shifted. "I want to say something," Marcus began. "I know I probably sound like a greeting card right now, but I need to say it anyway. I'm grateful, not just for therapy, but for everything that happened. For the hard parts, for the people who left, for the guilt, for all of it." His therapist smiled. "Tell me more." "I spent 48 years proving my worth by how much I could do for other people. I measured myself by my usefulness, and I was absolutely exhausted. I was disappearing. But I didn't see it because I was told it was noble. That's what made it so insidious. The world rewarded me for abandoning myself." Marcus paused, choosing his next words carefully. "What I understand now is that setting boundaries wasn't selfish. Protecting my time wasn't cold. Saying no wasn't betrayal. Those were acts of survival. And more than that, they were acts of self-respect. And maybe for the first time in my life, I'm actually respecting myself." This is the paradox that the people-pleaser must eventually confront. The thing that feels most selfish, putting yourself on the list of people who matter, is actually the most sane and sustainable choice you can make. Think about it logically. If you run yourself into the ground, if you exhaust your emotional reserves, if you abandon yourself to manage everyone else's comfort, what exactly are you offering them? An empty shell? A resentful performance? a human being who has forgotten how to be human. But when you care for yourself, when you have boundaries, when you honor your own needs alongside others, suddenly you have actual presence to give. You have genuine kindness rather than obligatory service. You have energy rather than resentment. Marcus's mother called one evening. They had become genuinely close over the past year, not through Marcus's constant availability, but through his consistency and honesty. She said something that surprised him. "I'm proud of you. I know I didn't understand what you were doing at first, but watching you stand up for yourself, it made me do the same. I started saying no to things. I started asking for what I actually wanted instead of just accepting whatever was offered. You showed me it was possible." Marcus felt tears well up. His mother who had weaponized guilt for so long, had learned from his boundaries. Not by him lecturing her, but by him modeling something different. This is what happens when you stop abandoning yourself. Everyone around you has to adjust. And some of them, watching your courage, find their own. His daughter pulled him aside one afternoon. She was 17 now, tall and thoughtful. "Dad, I wanted to tell you something. I was talking to my friend Emma about boundaries. She was asking how you do it, how you say no without feeling terrible. And I realized, you're teaching me that I don't have to say yes to everything, that I can have needs, that I can disappoint people and still be lovable. I think that's going to save me from a lot of heartache." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. His nervous system, trained over decades to believe that his worth came from his willingness to sacrifice, suddenly heard a different message. Your self-respect is actually a gift to your children. Your boundaries are protection, not punishment. The myths that had ruled his life for so long, that good people sacrifice themselves, that needs are selfish, that you're only valuable when you're useful, that disapproval means you're failing, that guilt is truth. All of these started to dissolve when Marcus made one simple choice: to believe that he deserved his own care as much as anyone else did. And here's what nobody tells you. Once you make that choice, you can't unmake it. You can't unknow that you're allowed to prioritize yourself. You can't unhear the quiet voice that says, "This matters. Your time matters. Your peace matters. Your presence matters." But there's also grief in this knowledge. Grief for the years spent running in the wrong direction. Grief for relationships built on false foundations. Grief for the younger Marcus, who didn't know he was allowed to say no. What helps, Marcus learned, is to stop spending so much time looking backward. Yes, you can acknowledge the years. You can grieve what was lost, but you can't live there. The only direction that makes sense is forward. On his birthday that year, Marcus's family asked what he wanted to do. Without hesitation, he said, "I want to spend time with people who genuinely want to be with me. I want to feel fully present instead of performing. I want to laugh without worrying if I'm taking up too much space. I want to be honest about how I'm doing." They went to a restaurant he actually wanted to try. They didn't rush. Nobody checked their phones constantly. His wife held his hand. His kids asked him real questions. His mother sat across from him and smiled, a genuine smile, not laced with hidden guilt. And for the first time in decades, Marcus wasn't busy calculating what everyone else needed. He was just there. If you're reading this and you're recognizing yourself in Marcus's story, if you're someone who has spent your life saying yes when you meant no, who has confused obligation with love, who has mistaken your usefulness for your worth, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to have needs. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to disappoint people. You are allowed to be honest about what you can and cannot do. You are allowed to protect your own peace. You are allowed to leave relationships that are harming you. You are allowed to exist without proving your existence. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to be selfish sometimes. Most importantly, you are allowed to live a life that feels like yours. The transition will be uncomfortable. You will feel guilt. You will lose people you thought would stay. You will question yourself constantly. There will be moments where you want to slide back into the familiar patterns because they're easier, because they don't require you to believe in your own worth. But on the other side of that discomfort is something remarkable. Your own life. A life where your choices reflect your values, where your relationships are reciprocal, where you can be generous because you're giving from abundance rather than desperation, where you can rest without guilt, where you can say no and it doesn't feel like a betrayal. Marcus didn't become a different person. He's still kind, still generous, still thoughtful about others' needs. But now he's also kind to himself, generous with his own time, thoughtful about his own needs. He's not perfect. There are still moments when old patterns surface, when guilt creeps in, when he catches himself sliding into people-pleasing. But he catches himself faster now. And more importantly, he doesn't spiral into shame about it. He just notices and adjusts. That ultimately is what this journey is about. Not becoming someone completely new, not severing all your relationships and becoming a hermit, not swinging to the opposite extreme and becoming callous or unkind. It's about integrating, learning to be both caring and boundaried, both generous and protective of yourself, both responsive to others and responsive to yourself. It's about learning to exist as a complete person instead of a servant to other people's needs. And it starts with one decision: to believe that you matter enough to take up space, that your life is worth living on your own terms, that your peace is worth protecting. If you've been wondering whether you deserve that, whether you deserve boundaries, respect, honesty, and authentic presence, the answer is yes. Not because you've earned it through productivity or usefulness, but simply because you exist. You are allowed to exist, and everything else flows from that.